we're going to troubleshoot the Laravel Socialite invalid state exception. This error often pops up when you're using Socialite to handle authentication with providers like Google, Facebook, or Twitter. It typically means something went wrong during the OAuth flow, and Socialite couldn't successfully retrieve the necessary user information. Let's break down the common causes and how to fix them. 1. Incorrect callback URL. This is the most frequent culprit. Your callback URL in your Socialite configuration must precisely match the URL specified in your chosen provider's settings, Google, Facebook, etc. Even a minor difference, like a trailing slash or a missing parameter, will trigger this error. Double-check both your Laravel application's configuration, usually in config/services.php, and the provider's developer console for an exact match. Pay close attention to HTTPS versus HTTP. They're not interchangeable. If you're developing locally, use a publicly accessible URL or configure your provider to accept localhost addresses. 2. Missing or incorrect provider credentials. Ensure that you've properly configured your Socialite provider settings in config/services.php. Make sure you have the correct client ID, client secret, and redirect URI. Missing any of these or using incorrect values will prevent the authentication process from completing correctly, resulting in the invalid state exception. Verify these credentials directly in your provider's developer dashboard. 3. State mismatch. Socialite uses a state parameter for security to prevent CSRF, cross-site request forgery, attacks. If the state parameter returned by the provider doesn't match the state parameter generated by your application, you'll get this exception. This usually indicates a problem with your session handling. Make sure your session is correctly configured and that nothing is interfering with its operation. Check for any custom middleware or session management that might be altering the state parameter. Ensure that your session driver is set up correctly and that your session lifetime is sufficient for the authentication process. 4. Provider-specific issues. Sometimes, the problem isn't with your Laravel application, but rather with the social authentication provider itself. Check the provider's documentation or developer console for any known outages, maintenance issues, or rate limits that could be interfering. Their APIs may have encountered temporary errors. Look for error messages provided by the provider itself within the redirect response or error logs. 5. Debugging techniques. Enable detailed logging in Laravel to catch any other exceptions that might be masked by the invalid state exception. Carefully examine the error logs. Socialite usually provides additional details in the exception which can provide more context into what went wrong during the authorization request. Use Laravel's debugging tools, such as DED or logging, to inspect the request and response objects at various points in the authentication flow. This will help to pinpoint the exact stage where the failure is happening. Also, try testing with a different browser or device to rule out browser-specific issues or caching problems. Addressing these points should help resolve the Laravel Socialite invalid state exception. Remember to thoroughly check each step and pay close attention to detail, especially when comparing URLs and credentials. Debugging social authentication often requires carefully tracing the flow of information between your application and the authentication